Hello everyone, welcome back to True Crime and Felines, where every Friday one or more of my 14 felines and I sit down and we talk about a true case or mystery. This week's case deals with Sylvia Likens. She was a 16-year-old girl who died at the abuse of somebody who was supposed to be watching her. Now this case is very heavy, so viewer discretion is advised, as it includes abuse and torture of a child. This case was said to be the worst and most diabolical case in Indiana's history. So if you're still with me, let's get started. So Betty and Lester Liken was actually a poor family, and they had 5 children. Their oldest daughter, Diana, was actually married and starting a family of their own, but they had 4 remaining children that they had to care for. They had trouble finding work and finally decided to join a traveling carnival in order to make some money. Out of their children, their 2 sons were actually placed with their grandparents, and their 2 daughters, Jenny, who was 15, and Sylvia, who was 16, was placed with a family friend named Gertrude Baniszewski. Now, Gertrude was a very bitter and mean woman. Gertrude actually dropped out of school at 16 so she could marry John Baniszewski. John was known to have a bad temper and was known to regularly abuse Gertrude. Now, in the course of their 10-year marriage, they would have 4 children together. Over the years, Gertrude would actually suffer many miscarriages, and many people believed it was because of the abuse she was getting from John. Now, after John and Gertrude divorced, Gertrude found another guy named Edward, and they married. Edward would end up leaving Gertrude after 3 months because he didn't want to take care of another man's children. After that, Gertrude and John would reconcile and they got married again. This time the marriage lasts 7 years and produced 2 more children. Gertrude and John got divorced again, and that was that. It was for good. When Gertrude was 37 years old, she would start a fling with a younger man named Dennis. He was about 22 or 23 years old. This would produce the 7th and very last child for Gertrude. Now, after the child was born, Dennis would abandon Gertrude and leave her to care for 7 kids. So taking care of all those 7 kids would be detrimental to Gertrude. She didn't have a lot of money. John was very unreliable with child support, and Dennis has all but just disappeared. So Gertrude's health started declining. With all the stress, she chain smoked. Her hygiene practices were very poor, and by this time her appearance became skeletal-like. Things did not help when Gertrude found out her oldest daughter, Paula, who was 17 at the time, was pregnant. What made things worse is Paula was pregnant because she had a fling with an older married man who then did not want anything to do with her. Now, Gertrude wanted to give the appearance that she was a nice woman and a pure family, so she kept this pregnancy a secret from everyone. To make money, Gertrude would iron clothes and do laundry for neighbors and also do some babysitting. And that's how the Likens came to find her and agreed to pay her $20 a week to watch Sylvia and Jenny starting in July of 1965. Now, when the Likens dropped their daughters off at Gertrude's home, if they would have just stepped further inside the house instead of staying in the living room, they would have probably rethought their decision. But unfortunately, they were in a hurry and dropped off their girls and left. See, because Gertrude was so poor, the house didn't have a stove, no phone. There wasn't even enough beds for all of her kids, let alone Sylvia and Jenny. Because Gertrude was in a state of depression, she didn't clean the house, and there was layers of dirt on the counters in the kitchen. And she had no money for food, so the only thing in the cupboards was bread and crackers. Now, the first week that Jenny and Sylvia stayed in the house, it was normal. They went to school, they attended social functions, and they even went to church with Gertrude. At the end of the week, when the $20 was due from their parents, it was late. And that's when Gertrude snapped. She made both Jenny and Sylvia lay on their bellies on the beds and pull down their skirts and underwear, and then she spanked them with a paddle, saying, "I don't take care of you bitches for a week and not get paid for it." Now, a couple days later, Lester Likens would show up with the check and everything was fine. Sylvia and Jenny would never tell their parents about what happened out of fear of Gertrude. So the next week after that, Jenny and Sylvia decided to gather some cans and turn them in for some money so they could get some candy at the local general store. When they came back to Gertrude's house with the candy, all hell broke loose. Gertrude accused them of stealing it and didn't believe their story how they collected the cans for money. Gertrude again brought out the paddle and demanded them to bend over. Sylvia would save her sister Jenny from the spankings with the paddle and say that she would take all of the spankings for her. So Gertrude paddled away on Sylvia, and that was just the start of a very vicious downward spiral. Now, shortly thereafter, Gertrude's children would start telling lies to Gertrude about Sylvia just to get her in trouble. One such lie was that they told their mother how disgusted they were with Sylvia because while she was at school or not at Gertrude's home, she would eat copious amounts of food and just stuff her face. Of course, that wasn't true, but Gertrude chose to believe it because, of course, her children are saints and can't do anything wrong. Gertrude would scold Sylvia for ruining her figure. In an ironic punishment, Gertrude would force Sylvia to eat a hot dog with a huge amount of condiments on it. She made Sylvia eat every last bit of it, and Sylvia would end up vomiting. Gertrude, upset that she wasted food, would then make Sylvia eat her vomit. So now it's August of 1965, and Gertrude's mental health was declining just as fast as her physical health. And for some reason, Sylvia was in her crosshairs. Gertrude overheard Sylvia telling one of her friends that she let a boy feel her up one time. Gertrude flew into a rage, and she would call Sylvia a prostitute, and then savagely and repeatedly kicked her in the crotch. After the attack, Sylvia attempted to sit down on the couch, and Gertrude would pick her up and throw her down on the floor. And she told her, "You ain't fit to sit in chairs." Gertrude would then encourage her own children to start attacking and beating on Sylvia. They would push her down the stairs and constantly hit her, trip her, anything they could do to harass her. When Gertrude was in the middle of a session of beating Sylvia, she would get exhausted, and then she would demand Paula, the 17-year-old pregnant daughter, and her oldest son, John, who was 13 at the time, to finish the beatings. Now, due to all this stuff going on at Gertrude's house, out of defiance, Jenny and Sylvia went to school and started a rumor. They would tell their classmates that they saw Gertrude's daughters, Paula, who is pregnant, and her other daughter, Stephanie, that they would have sex with boys for money. So she was pretty much accusing them of being prostitutes. Stephanie had a boyfriend at the time who was 15 years old, and his name was Coy. When Coy found out what Sylvia had been saying about his girlfriend, he arrived at Gertrude's house to confront her. With Gertrude's encouragement, Gertrude told him, "Hit her, punch her, beat her up." which he did. And after that, Gertrude said that Coy was welcome to come to the house at any time and practice his judo on Sylvia. Gertrude would continue making things worse for Sylvia by telling her classmates lies. She would tell one classmate that Sylvia was saying bad things about her mother and then encouraged her to come over to the house and beat Sylvia up. Then one time, Gertrude demanded Jenny to punch her own sister in the face. When Jenny refused, Gertrude started hitting Jenny until Jenny relented and agreed to punch Sylvia in the face. Now, at the same time, Gertrude got new neighbors who moved in next door, the Vermillions, Phyllis and Raymond. They would later claim to witness a lot of the abuse being done to Sylvia, but would never speak up. They once saw Sylvia walking around with a black eye. Paula, this pregnant 17-year-old, proudly stated that she was the one that gave Sylvia the black eye. Paula would then take a steaming cup of hot water under Gertrude's watch and throw it in Sylvia's face. The Vermillions witnessed this whole thing and never reported it. 2 months later, closer to Sylvia's death, Phyllis would go to Gertrude's house to ask to borrow something. Phyllis would notice Sylvia walking around in a daze with all these bruises. She had swollen lips and both of her eyes were blackened. One was so bad that it was swollen shut. Paula, again, proud of her handiwork, ripped the belt off of her and started beating Sylvia with it right in front of Phyllis. Again, Phyllis never reported it. In September, Sylvia would come home from school and tell Gertrude that she needed a new sweatsuit for gym class. Gertrude told her that they couldn't afford one, so she couldn't have one. So Sylvia, being desperate, ended up stealing one from another classmate. Gertrude found out about the theft. Gertrude would end up burning the tips of Sylvia's fingers with a lit cigarette to break her habit of sticky fingers. After this incident, anyone in the household that smoked, which included Paula and some of the older kids and some of the neighborhood kids that would come over and beat Sylvia, they would start putting their cigarettes out all over Sylvia's body. Now, Gertrude started being on this kick about Sylvia being a prostitute and would punish her for it even though it wasn't true. But to prove her point, she would make Sylvia do very degrading things. One time she had all of her sons gather and the neighborhood boys gather in her living room. She then forced Sylvia to strip down naked and masturbate with a Coke bottle. When Sylvia apparently wasn't doing it correctly, Gertrude helped, and it would cause injury to Sylvia. After this, she became incontinent. So this is when Gertrude started locking her in the basement. So Sylvia would do her business on the floor, or she would wet herself when she was asleep. Gertrude would then start what she called the bathing regiment, which included tying Sylvia's wrists and ankles together and then dunking her in a tub full of scalding hot water. This became a daily regimen that Sylvia had to go through. Now, during this time, there was a neighborhood kid named Ricky, and he was 14 years old. He started acting as Gertrude's personal assistant and would assist on any of Gertrude's weird punishments for Sylvia. Now, Ricky was an honor student and he came from a prominent middle-class family, and he never had any legal trouble in his past. It was speculated that Gertrude and Ricky were lovers, and that is the reason why he carried out any orders given to him by Gertrude, because he was getting sex from her. But I can't find where that was ever substantiated or proven. It's just speculation. Now, Sylvia became kind of a neighborhood spectacle as Gertrude would invite all the neighborhood kids to come over and gawk at Sylvia. She would make Sylvia stay nude, or she would invite them to participate in the abuse that they were giving her. Sylvia was kept naked most of the time at this point and hardly ever fed. Now, Gertrude's children at this time turned this into a money-making scheme, and as the neighborhood kids would come over and either participate in abuse or watch what was going on, they would make them pay a nickel each. One young gal who paid a nickel to watch the spectacle actually ended up going home and telling her mother what she saw, and she stated that they were kicking and hitting Sylvia. Unfortunately, her mom told her that Sylvia must have done something wrong and to mind your own business. Now, the reverend that ran the church that Gertrude visited every Sunday actually would make home visits to his parishioners, and he would visit Gertrude as well. They would have coffee, and Gertrude would complain to him about Sylvia. Gertrude would tell the reverend that Sylvia was a prostitute. She regularly slept with married men, and she was pregnant. She would also say that her kids were saints, including Paula, who was a virgin and pure, even though Paula was about 3 months pregnant at this time. Now, Jenny was able to sneak a letter to her older sister, Diana, explained the horrors that were going on at the house. Diana ignored the letter at first, thinking Jenny and Sylvia were just making things up so they could come live with her and not with this stranger. However, Diana would eventually come and visit Gertrude's house to check on her sisters. Gertrude met Diana at the door and would not let her in. She then told Diana that she would call the police if she didn't leave immediately. Diana left the house, but she hid nearby and waited for either Jenny or Sylvia to leave the house. Now, at this time, Sylvia was being locked up in the basement and wasn't even going to school. So Jenny had left the house, and Diana had caught up with her and asked her what was going on. Jenny would end up running away from her sister out of the fear because Gertrude told her if she told Diana anything that was going on, that she would end up in the basement with Sylvia. Now, Diana saw all through this and ended up calling social services. A social worker would come out and visit with Gertrude. Gertrude told the social worker that Sylvia was kicked out for being, you got it, a prostitute, and ran away. Well, which is it? Gertrude, did you kick her out or did she run away? Gertrude threatened Jenny to corroborate her story or she was going to be put in the basement with her sister. So Jenny reluctantly told the social worker the same story, and the case was closed. The case would say that Sylvia was no longer in the house, so no more visits to the home were needed. So months have gone by, and it's now October 1965. The girls have been in the house since July, just 4 short months. Gertrude had brought Sylvia up from the basement and strapped her to a mattress. She told her if she could make it through the night without wetting the bed, then she can start sleeping upstairs with the other children. Unfortunately, Sylvia wasn't able to make it through the night due to her incontinence. Her punishment was a repeat of having Gertrude's boys and the neighborhood boys watch her masturbate with a Coke bottle. However, this time, Gertrude didn't stop there. After kicking her in the crotch again for several times, she flew into another rage. She yelled at Sylvia and said, "You labeled my daughters as prostitutes, so I'm labeling you physically." Gertrude took a sewing needle out of her sewing kit, heated it up, and started carving the words, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," on Sylvia's stomach. Now, Gertrude only got out the words, "I am," and became exhausted. She then handed the needle to Ricky, her alleged lover, and had him finish it. Sylvia ended up passing out from the pain. Then Gertrude's 10-year-old daughter Shirley took the needle and carved a number 3 above it. Sylvia was then taken back downstairs to the basement. Jenny was able to sneak down to the basement that night to talk to Sylvia. Sylvia told her that night she was going to die, and she just knew it. Jenny was at a loss of what to do. Now, by this time, Sylvia's body was just riddled with abuse and scars, and now a carved lettering in her stomach. Gertrude decided that she better cover her crimes, so she brought Sylvia upstairs and offered her food in exchange that she would write a letter that Gertrude dictated to her. The letter would state that Sylvia went with a bunch of boys to, earn money as, you got it, a prostitute. And after they had their way with her, they beat her and then carved on her stomach. The funny part of this letter is Gertrude insisted that the letter start with, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Likens." Now, if your daughter was writing a letter to you, wouldn't it start with, "Dear Mom and Dad"? She also made Sylvia include in the letter that Sylvia did everything she could just to make Gertrude mad because she was jealous of Gertrude and her success and money. After Sylvia wrote the letter, Gertrude went in the other room and started talking to her son, John. They started making arrangements on what to do with Sylvia, and the plan is to take Sylvia out in the forest and just leave her to die. Sylvia attempted at that moment to escape the house. She actually got outside, but she was so weak from everything she couldn't keep on going. Ricky and Gertrude got her back in the house and would end up beating her with a curtain rod. Gertrude would stomp on her head and then have her taken back downstairs unconscious. Later that night, Gertrude would take crackers down to Sylvia and offer them to her. Sylvia told Gertrude to feed the crackers to the dog because he's hungrier than I am. Gertrude got mad and punched Sylvia in the stomach and then went back upstairs. Now, the next morning, Gertrude, still angry that Sylvia refused the crackers, would go down in the basement to beat Sylvia some more. But in her haste and frustration, she would end up giving herself a black eye. She would then direct Ricky to beat Sylvia with a broomstick, which he gladly did. That was the last time that Sylvia would known to be alive. The next morning, Sylvia was brought up from downstairs by Gertrude to do a bathing regimen. They put her in the tub and then realized Sylvia wasn't breathing. Stephanie, Gertrude's daughter, tried to give Sylvia CPR, but nothing seemed to work. Unfortunately, Sylvia was gone. Gertrude directed Ricky to take Sylvia back downstairs, put her on a mattress, and go find the police, since there was no phone in the house. So Ricky did just that. When the police showed up, Gertrude gave the police the letter that she made Sylvia write. Gertrude's plan was, once the police left, is to go put her out somewhere to be found. Now, while Gertrude was talking to one of the policemen, Jenny had been able to pull aside another policeman. She told the policeman, "Get me out of here and I will tell you everything." Now, the policeman led Jenny out the door, and Jenny told the policeman everything and said that Sylvia was dead and she was down in the basement. And Gertrude and her kids are the one that caused this. Gertrude, Paula, John Jr., Stephanie, Ricky, and Coy, who were all there that morning, and some other neighborhood kids were all arrested and taken into custody at that time. They went down in the basement and saw Sylvia. Even with the letter in hand and Gertrude's story, they soon did not believe it because Sylvia's wounds were in a state of both fresh and recently healed and healed months before that. They did an autopsy on Sylvia and determined that she had over 100 cigarette burns on her body. Second degree and third degree burns from the bathing regimens, bruising, muscle and nerve damage, and her vaginal cavity was pretty much swollen shut. The official cause of death was brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging, and shock. In May of 1966, that's when the trial started, and they were all being tried together. The prosecutors, having no remorse for the age of the kids, said, "I want the death penalty for Gertrude, Paula, John Jr., Ricky, and Coy." John was only 13 at the time, and Ricky was only 14 at the time. Now, during the trial, it had to be interrupted as Paula went into labor. She was rushed to the hospital to give birth to the child she wasn't pregnant with. She would end up having a girl, and she named it Gertrude after her mother. The baby was then put up for adoption since Paula was pretty much going to jail and the father did not want anything to do with it. Once the trial got started again, even though all the defendants were being tried together, they all had different lawyers. Comically, they all started blaming each other. Gertrude's attorney would blame the children, saying that the place was such a madhouse, Gertrude couldn't keep track of what was going on, and she had nothing to do with it. The children's attorney would blame Gertrude and say that she was the mastermind behind it and would encourage them to do it, and they were scared that they might get beaten as well. Now, Paula was found guilty for second-degree murder, but she ended up striking a plea bargain and ended up voluntary manslaughter. She would serve 3 years before she got paroled. John, Ricky, and Coy, who were all underage, was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and got 18 months in a juvenile detention facility. Gertrude was found guilty of first-degree murder, and she got life in prison without parole. But she would end up appealing because later her lawyer would come out and say, "In my opinion, she should get the electric chair." So she had another trial. She was found guilty. However, they changed her sentence to 18 to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In 1985, after serving 19 years in prison, Gertrude was paroled. Despite Sylvia's family and the public outcry, upon her release, Gertrude would state that, "I'm not sure what role I had in it because I was on drugs. I never really knew her," meaning Sylvia. "I wish I could undo it, but I can't. And I'm sorry. I'm just asking for mercy and nothing else." You want mercy, Gertrude? You want mercy. Gertrude's younger kids were actually put into foster care. Her first husband, John, would eventually gain custody of all of them back. He did end up changing his name as the Baniszewski name was now tarnished. The charges were dropped on the younger children and the neighborhood children as well. Now, after she was paroled, Gertrude would end up moving to Iowa. She lived a life in obscurity until she died of lung cancer in 1990. Paula would move to Iowa also, and she assumed a new identity and became a teacher's aide. However, in 2012, she was fired from that job after an anonymous tip came in telling the school who she really was. Paula still lives in Iowa and is married and has children of her own. Stephanie, the second oldest daughter, became a school teacher. She also assumed a new name, and she lives in Florida with several children. She was never convicted of anything because she ended up testifying against her family. John Jr., who is now John Blake, worked various jobs but ended up being a deacon and very active in his church. Out of all the family members, John is the only one who has ever admitted responsibility for what he had done and his role in Sylvia's murder. In 1998, he came out and stated that a harsher sentence for him would have been more justified, and he wishes he could go back and do things differently. John would end up dying at the age of 52 of complications with diabetes. Coy, who was Stephanie's boyfriend at the time and would practice his judo on Sylvia, he never did change his name, and he was repeatedly jailed for various offenses after he got out of juvenile detention. He was even tried for murders of 2 men in 1977, but was eventually acquitted of those. He ended up dying of a heart attack at age 56. Ricky, who was Gertrude's alleged lover, was released when he was 17 from the juvenile detention. He would end up having a nervous breakdown over the remorse of his crimes, and he began smoking very heavily, which would end up putting him into his grave at age 21 of lung cancer. Jenny, Sylvia's sister, would end up getting married and having children of her own. Upon Gertrude's death, Jenny mailed the obituary with a note to her mother, Betty, saying, "Some good news. Damn old Gertrude died. Haha, I am happy about that." Jenny died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Betty, the girl's mother, died in 1998, and Lester, the girl's father, died in 2013. Jenny has always said she does not blame her parents for what happened, that their only fault was trusting Gertrude in the first place. The house was demolished in 2009 and is now a church parking lot. And in 2001, a 6-foot memorial stone was created in honor of Sylvia and placed in Willard Park, where it stands today as a reminder of what this poor girl went through. Now, a lot of people are like, why did Gertrude do this? Why did she take all of her frustration out on Sylvia? And it may be never known, but a lot of people have speculated that Sylvia was a pretty girl, and she may have reminded Gertrude of her youth and how she squandered it away in her life. So it could have just been simple jealousy. That is the story of Sylvia Likens. And there always comes a moral of the story of, guys, if you see something, say something. Don't come out after the fact, after somebody's dead, and go, you know, that one time I did see. Speak up. Sylvia could have been rescued so many times and lived out her life, but nobody chose to say anything. So that is our case this week. I hope everybody has a happy and safe Thanksgiving, and we will see you next week. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you know when a new video is up. See you later, guys. Bye.